The last time I saw my son-in-law Harold Stanton look genuinely frightened was on a Wednesday afternoon in early November, when he stood in my kitchen holding a letter from Revenue Canada with both hands, and the paper was shaking. Not his hands. The paper! Because his hands had gone completely still. "What does this mean?" he asked, and his voice came out smaller than I had ever heard it. I looked at him across the counter, 63 years old, and I had learned to read people the way some women learn to read weather. "You watch long enough, you stop needing words. It means exactly what it says," I told him. He stared at me. Not at the letter, at me. As though he was seeing something he hadn't expected to find. I understood that feeling. I had spent the better part of 4 years discovering things I hadn't expected either. My name is Constance Merritt. I was born in Fredericton, raised in Moncton, and I have lived in the same city of Halifax my entire adult life. I am 64 years old. I have one daughter, my daughter Lily. No, I must be careful. My daughter's name is not Lily. My daughter's name is Nora. Nora Merritt before she became Nora Stanton. Let me start again. Because that is something I have learned to do. My name is Constance Merritt. I am 64 years old. I raised my daughter Nora alone after her father, my first husband, passed away when she was 11. I worked as an administrative coordinator for a medical clinic in Halifax for 31 years. I was not wealthy. I was not powerful. But I was careful, and I was organized. And I understood numbers the way some people understand music. Not as something you study, but as something you simply hear. When Nora met Harold Stanton, she was 29. He was 37. He had a self-assurance that filled a room without raising his voice. The kind of confidence that certain men carry so naturally you forget to question whether it's earned. He owned a property management company. Mid-sized, successful enough to be respectable. He drove a good car. He shook hands the way men do when they want you to trust them before you've decided to. I liked him well enough in the beginning. Or perhaps I wanted to like him, for Nora's sake. Those two things are easy to confuse. They married 2 years later, a summer wedding in the Annapolis Valley. Nora wore her grandmother's pearls. The afternoon was warm and golden and full of the kind of light that makes you believe the future will be kind. For a while it was. The first years were ordinary in the good way. Nora worked as a graphic designer. Harold's company grew. They bought a house in the south end of Halifax, a beautiful old Victorian on a street lined with elm trees. I visited on Sundays. We cooked together, Nora and I. We talked about everything and nothing. Then, gradually, the conversations changed. Not suddenly. That is the thing no one warns you about. It does not happen suddenly. It happens in small degrees, like a room growing darker. So slowly you don't reach for the light until you can no longer see. The first time I noticed something, Nora and I were sitting at her kitchen table, going over recipes for Christmas dinner. Harold came home mid-afternoon, looked at the papers spread between us, and said something that stayed with me long after the day ended. "You're not looking at the finances again, are you?" He said it lightly, with a small laugh. Directed at me, not at Nora. I set down my tea. "Just recipes," he smiled. "Good, that's your department." He meant it as a joke, I think. The table laughed. Nora included, one of those automatic laughs people produce to smooth over awkward moments. I smiled too. But later, driving home along the waterfront, I kept hearing the word department. The way he'd divided us so cleanly. Recipes. That's your department. It was a small thing. I told myself it was a small thing. Over the years that followed, the small things accumulated. When Nora mentioned wanting to look at their investment portfolio, Harold would redirect the conversation. "You don't need to worry about that. It's complicated." When she asked about the mortgage renewal, he'd say, "It's handled, sweetheart." When she raised questions about their retirement savings, he'd put an arm around her and tell her that was exactly why she had him. I watched it happen the way you watch fog roll in over the harbor. By the time you realize how thick it's become, you're already inside it. What troubled me more than anything was not that Harold managed their finances. Couples divide responsibilities. That is normal. What troubled me was the way he framed it. Not as a division of labor, but as a division of ability. He was capable. Nora was not. He understood. She didn't need to. And slowly, almost without realizing it, Nora began to believe him. My daughter is not a foolish woman. She is creative and perceptive and deeply kind. But she had been told consistently and gently and by someone she loved that certain things were beyond her, After long enough, even the most intelligent person starts to mistake someone else's limitation for their own. I noticed it one Sunday when she couldn't tell me which bank held their mortgage. Then later when she mentioned that Harold handled all their tax filings and she'd never actually reviewed them. Then when she said, almost in passing, that she didn't have her name on their investment accounts because Harold said it was cleaner that way. I said nothing at the time. She was happy, or she seemed happy, and I was her mother, not her accountant. I told myself it wasn't my place. That phrase would come back to haunt me. About 3 years into the marriage, I began to notice other things. Harold traveled frequently. Toronto, Calgary, Vancouver, always for work, always briefly explained and quickly dropped as a topic. He upgraded his car twice in 18 months. He began attending events alone, charity galas and industry dinners, where Nora was either not invited or quietly discouraged from attending. "You'd be bored," he'd say. "It's all business talk." There was a dinner, a firm's anniversary celebration, where I sat across from Harold and watched him speak about financial planning with a confidence that impressed the entire table. When someone asked me a question about my own retirement savings, I was 61 at the time, the question was natural. Harold laughed before I could answer. "Constance leaves that to the professionals," he said. The table chuckled. I smiled. That night I did not sleep well. I was not a foolish woman either. I had spent 31 years managing the administrative and financial records of a medical clinic. I understood budgets. I understood documentation. I understood what it meant when information disappeared from places where it should have been. And information, I was beginning to notice, had been disappearing. When Nora mentioned that Harold's company had taken on a significant new loan, I asked a simple question. Had she reviewed the terms? She said Harold handled all of that. When she mentioned they'd refinanced the house, I asked to see the documents out of curiosity. She said Harold kept them at the office. When I asked whether her name was still on the title, she paused for a moment longer than she should have. "I'm sure it is," she said. But she didn't know, that was the thing. She was no longer sure of basic facts about her own life, and she had been convinced, so thoroughly and so gently, that not knowing was normal, was even appropriate, was what wives did when they trusted their husbands. I did not push. I worried, but I did not push. The moment everything shifted came on a Thursday in late September. Nora called me at 7:30 in the morning. Her voice had a quality I hadn't heard since she was a child, thin, controlled, the sound a person makes when they are working very hard not to cry. "Mom, can you come over?" I was in the car within 10 minutes. When I arrived, she was sitting at the kitchen table with a letter in her hands. She looked up when I came in, and what I saw in her face was not grief and not anger. It was confusion. The deep, disorienting confusion of someone who has just been told the map they've been following doesn't match the territory. "It came yesterday," she said. Harold opened it. "He said it was nothing, just a filing error. He'd take care of it." She paused. "But then he left this morning before I was awake, and the letter was still on the counter." I sat down beside her. The letter was from the Canada Revenue Agency. It referenced a business entity, Stanton and Merritt Holdings, and it referenced a name. Her name, Nora Stanton, as a director. My daughter had never heard of Stanton and Merritt Holdings. She had never attended a board meeting, never signed incorporation documents, never agreed to serve as director of anything. She had certainly never given permission for her name to be used. I read the letter twice. Then I set it carefully on the table and looked at my daughter. "How long has Harold been handling all of your financial paperwork?" I asked. She thought about it. "Since the beginning, really. He said it was easier. Has he ever asked you to sign documents you didn't fully review?" Another pause. "Longer, sometimes. Stacks of things, mortgage renewals, tax stuff. I'd sign where he pointed." I kept my voice even. "Okay, Mom." Her eyes filled. "What does this mean?" I touched her hand. "It means we need to find out more before we panic." That was the face I showed her. Inside, I was already thinking very quickly. That afternoon, while Nora rested, she hadn't slept. I sat in her study with a cup of tea gone cold and opened her laptop. I wasn't looking for anything dramatic, I was simply looking. 31 years of administrative work had taught me that the truth is usually buried in the ordinary places. Folders nobody opens. Notifications nobody reads. CC'd emails that accumulated while everyone was looking somewhere else. I found it in an email thread from 14 months earlier. Not hidden, just unread. One of hundreds in a folder Nora had labeled Harold Work, without ever really processing what arrived there. A correspondence chain between Harold and a woman named Diane Forsyth, who appeared to be a corporate accountant. The emails were businesslike, professional, but the name in the company references appeared again and again. Stanton and Merritt Holdings. And underneath, cross-referenced in a linked document, a second entity, Pacific Coast Asset Group. I wrote both names down. Then I found the third thing, the one that made my hands go very still on the keyboard. A notification, 9 months old, from a financial institution I didn't recognize. Account correspondence. The name on the account was not Harold Stanton. It was Nora Stanton. An account Nora had never opened. I closed the laptop carefully. I did not say anything to Nora that evening. I made her tea. I heated soup. I stayed until she fell asleep on the sofa with the television running softly in the background. Then I drove home and sat in my own kitchen in the dark for a long time. I am a practical woman. I have been practical my whole life because I did not have the luxury of being otherwise. When my first husband died and I was left with an 11-year-old daughter and a mortgage and a grief I did not have time to fully feel, I learned to move forward by separating what I could control from what I could not. I made lists. I took one step at a time. That night, I made a list. At the top, I wrote, "What do I know for certain?" And I was honest with myself about how little that was. The following morning, I called my old colleague Brenda Cochran. Brenda had retired 2 years before me from the clinic, but before that she had spent a decade working in trust administration at a law office. She was sharp and direct, and she had a way of laying out complicated situations in very simple terms that cut through confusion like light. She didn't answer the first time. I left a message. She called back within the hour. "I need some guidance," I told her, informally. "Someone close to me is in a situation I don't fully understand yet." Brenda listened as I described what I'd found. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Constance," she said, "does your daughter know a solicitor?" "Not yet. She needs one, I know. But first, I need to understand what I'm looking at." Another pause. Then Brenda sighed. "All right. Tell me what you have." For the next hour, we worked through it together. Brenda explained the implications of having a name attached to a corporate directorship without consent. She explained what CRA correspondence like this typically indicated. She used plain language and she did not soften things to protect my feelings, which is one of the reasons I have always trusted her. By the end of the call, I understood 3 things clearly. First, if Nora's name had been used to establish a business entity without her knowledge, that was potentially identity fraud. Second, if Nora had signed documents, under pressure or without understanding their contents, she could be legally exposed to the obligations of those companies. Third, this had almost certainly been happening for longer than 14 months. I thanked Brenda. Then I drove back to Nora's house. She was up, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee, still in the clothes she'd fallen asleep in. She looked at me when I came through the door, with an expression that broke my heart a little. Hope and dread in equal measure, the look of someone who wants the news to be manageable and isn't sure it will be. I sat down across from her. "I need to ask you something," I said. "And I need you to answer me honestly." She nodded. "Have you and Harold ever talked about his company's finances? The actual numbers?" She shook her head slowly. "He always said it was going well. Growing. Has he ever mentioned Pacific Coast Asset Group?" Nothing in her face. She'd never heard the name. "Stanton and Merritt Holdings we know about from the letter. Has he mentioned any other companies? Any partners you haven't met?" "There's a woman he works with," Nora said. "Diane something. He mentioned her a few times. An accountant." She paused. "I've never met her." I kept my expression neutral. "Okay, Mom." Her voice dropped. "How bad is this?" I looked at my daughter. She was 42 years old, and she looked in that moment much younger. Not like a child, but like someone who has realized the ground beneath her is less solid than she believed. I wanted to reassure her. I wanted to tell her it would all turn out to be a misunderstanding, a paperwork error, a simple thing easily resolved. But I had spent my entire life teaching my daughter to face things honestly. I wasn't going to stop now. "I don't know yet," I said, "but I think it's serious, and I think we need help." 3 days later, we sat in the office of a solicitor named Graham Aldous. A man in his mid-50s with reading glasses, on a chain, and the unhurried manner of someone who had heard many difficult things and remained unshockable. Nora had found him through a referral from a colleague. He had a background in corporate law and family estates. He read through what we had brought, the CRA letter, the printouts from the email thread, the account notification, without rushing. When he finished, he removed his glasses and set them on the desk. "Mrs. Stanton," he said, "I want to be straightforward with you. This document suggests your name has been used in corporate filings without your direct authorization. That is a matter we need to investigate carefully." He paused. "I'd also recommend, as a precaution, that you review your personal financial accounts, savings, registered funds, any accounts in your name, as soon as possible." Nora went still. "Why?" Graham Aldous chose his words carefully. "Because in situations like this, it's not uncommon for personal assets to have been used as collateral without the account holder's full awareness." The room was very quiet. Later, in the car, Nora did not speak for a long time. We drove along the waterfront. The harbor was gray and flat, and the sky above it was the color of old pewter. Finally, she said, "I feel so stupid! Don't!" My voice came out sharper than I intended. I softened it. "You trusted your husband. That is not stupidity. I didn't ask questions. He made sure you wouldn't." I glanced over at her. "There's a difference." She was quiet again. Then, "How long do you think this has been going on?" I did not answer immediately, because I had been doing the arithmetic in my head for 3 days, and I did not like where the numbers led. "I think," I said carefully, "it started before you knew there was anything to notice." What followed was a month I would not wish on anyone. Harold returned from his trip. He claimed he'd been in Calgary, and seemed surprised to find Nora quieter than usual. He made no mention of the CRA letter. He did not ask whether she had looked into it further. He simply went back to the rhythms of their life, as though nothing had shifted. Nora said nothing. That was the hardest part, watching my daughter move through her days with this knowledge sitting inside her like a stone, while Harold talked about weekend plans and the new restaurant that had opened downtown. Meanwhile, we kept working. Graham Aldous began a formal review. Brenda pointed us toward a financial advisor she trusted who specialized in family law cases, and I, quietly, methodically, the way I had always done things, began pulling every document I could legitimately access. What I found, piece by piece, was not a simple story. Harold Stanton had not built a fraudulent company from nothing. That would have been in some ways easier to understand. What he had done was more complicated. He had built a real and successful property management business, and then, gradually, he had begun using its infrastructure to move money in ways that were increasingly difficult to explain. The corporate entities, Stanton and Merritt Holdings, Pacific Coast Asset Group, and eventually a third we discovered called Harborview Capital Partners, were not entirely fictitious. They had real assets, real transactions, real vendor relationships. But woven through all of it were financial structures that drew on Nora's identity in ways she had never agreed to, and the deeper the review went, the more troubling the picture became. There was a line of credit secured against Nora's registered retirement savings. She had not authorized it. The signatures on the authorization forms were hers, or appeared to be. When Graham had them examined by a document specialist, the conclusion was careful but significant. The signatures were consistent with forgery. There were property lease agreements listing Nora as a co-signatory on commercial assets she had never visited. There were loan guarantees bearing her name on obligations that had nothing to do with any business she knew existed. Each document alone might have been explained away. Together, they formed something undeniable. And then there was Diane Forsyth. I found her professional profile online without much difficulty. 44 years old, certified professional accountant, registered in British Columbia. Several articles mentioned her work in commercial real estate, a handful of photographs from industry events. In 3 of them, she stood beside Harold Stanton. Not as colleagues at a large table. Beside him. Closely, comfortably, in the particular way of people who are accustomed to each other's proximity. I did not mention this to Nora right away, not because I thought it would help to hide it, but because there was still a possibility, small, diminishing, but real, that I was reading more into it than existed. People take photographs. Colleagues attend the same events. The possibility disappeared on a Tuesday evening when I found, buried in the same email folder, a thread that had nothing to do with corporate accounting. I will not describe its contents in detail. I will say only that it made the professional relationship unambiguous. Harold Stanton had not merely used my daughter's name and identity without her consent. He had also been conducting an affair with the woman who helped him do it. I sat alone in Nora's study for a long time after reading those emails. The house was quiet. Nora was visiting a friend. Outside the window, the neighbors' children were playing in the last of the evening light. I am not a person given to dramatic gestures. I did not throw anything or slam a door. I simply sat there and felt the particular weight of knowing something that will change everything once it is spoken aloud. 31 years I had worked alongside people in their hardest moments. Patients, families, staff members in crisis. I had learned that some kinds of knowing sit in you very quietly and very heavily, and you simply have to carry them until the right moment arrives. I carried this one carefully. When I told Nora, I told her everything at once, not in pieces. She deserved the complete truth, and I was tired of the truth being something parceled out to protect people from it. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she didn't cry. She looked out the window for a very long time. Then she said, "How long?" At least 2 years based on the email timestamps, possibly longer. She was quiet. She helped him. Yes, another silence. She knew my name was on those documents, almost certainly. Nora looked at me. Her expression had changed. Not to anger, not yet. To something harder and clearer. The look of a woman who has decided to stop being surprised and start paying attention. "What do we do now?" she asked. That is the question I had been preparing to answer for weeks. We documented everything. Every email, every corporate filing, every discrepancy, every forged signature. Graham Aldous built a formal record. The financial advisor reconstructed a timeline of the account movements. Brenda, who had more experience with these structures than anyone I knew, helped us understand what each piece meant and how it fit with the others. The picture that emerged was not subtle. Harold had used Nora's identity to create the appearance of a co-directed corporate structure. Likely. Because it made certain tax arrangements and credit applications easier to manage. He had used her name on loan guarantees because her credit history was clean, and her personal assets were unencumbered. He had used her retirement savings as collateral without her knowledge, because it allowed him to access capital at terms he could not have secured on his own. And he had done it all while convincing everyone around him, including my daughter, that she wasn't capable of understanding any of it. That last part, that is what stayed with me longest. The money was recoverable, at least partially. Lawyers could work with money. Regulators could address the corporate structures. The forged signatures were a serious matter that would involve its own processes. But the years Nora had spent believing she was less capable than she was, those could not be recovered. They had simply been spent. Harold did not know how much we knew until the morning of Graham's first formal correspondence. The letter arrived at the house on a Friday. Harold read it in the kitchen, and I happened to be there. I had come to help Nora with some paperwork of our own. I watched him read it. He was very still for a long moment. Then he looked up. His eyes moved from Nora to me. There was something in that look I recognized. The rapid recalibration of a man realizing the situation is not what he believed it to be. "Nora," he said. "I can explain this." "I know you can," she said. "I'm sure you have a very thorough explanation." Something shifted in his expression. "I'll need to make some calls." "Of course." Her voice was completely steady. "Graham Aldis's number is at the bottom of that letter." He looked at her, then at me. I met his eyes and said nothing. There is a particular silence that arrives when someone realizes that the version of you they've been managing no longer exists. Harold Stanton stood in his own kitchen and encountered that silence, and I watched it move across his face like weather. He left the room. We heard his office door close. Nora waited until his footsteps had faded. Then she exhaled, a long, careful breath, the kind that carries a great deal with it. "Okay," she said quietly. She looked at me. "Okay." What came next was not clean or quick. These things rarely are. The legal process moved at its own pace, formal, complicated, often frustrating. There were meetings and counter-filings and periods of waiting that stretched longer than anyone wanted. Nora stayed in the house initially. Then she didn't. Then the house itself became part of what needed to be resolved. I will not walk through each step. What matters is what the steps revealed. The forged signatures were confirmed by 2 separate document examiners. The corporate entities were reviewed by a forensic accountant engaged through Graham's office. The retirement account irregularities were reported to the appropriate institutions. CRA's interest in the matter, it turned out, predated our own discovery by nearly 6 months. We had not been the first to notice something didn't add up. We had simply been the last to know. Diane Forsyth, for her part, cooperated with regulators when it became clear that her professional designation was at risk. She provided documentation. She did not protect Harold. People rarely protect someone when protection becomes expensive. Harold's property management company continued to operate in a reduced form. Many of its clients and employees were entirely uninvolved in his decisions, and they should not have suffered for them. But Harold himself faced consequences that were serious and lasting. Professional, financial, legal. He did not go to prison. Life is not always so tidy. But the life he had been living, the conferences and galas and the comfortable authority of a man who managed things, that life ended. I have thought a great deal in the years since about why he did it. Not the affair. That kind of thing has its own small and ordinary explanations. But the rest, the companies, the names, the documents. I don't believe Harold Stanton began with the intention of defrauding his wife. I believe he began with a small decision that was easier to make because she didn't know enough to question it. And then another, and then another. Each one made possible by the premise he had established from the beginning. That Nora didn't understand these things, that she didn't need to. That understanding was his domain, and she should be grateful to be relieved of it. The arrogance was not in the fraud. The arrogance was in the assumption that preceded it. Nora moved into an apartment in the north end of Halifax the following spring. Small, bright, overlooking a courtyard, with an old maple tree that turned extraordinary colors in October. She told me the morning she signed the lease that she felt, for the first time in years, like herself. I didn't ask her what that meant. I knew. Her relationship with me changed in ways that still move me when I think about them. Not because we had been distant before, we hadn't, but because there is a particular kind of closeness that grows from going through something hard together. She calls me most mornings now. We disagree about small things freely and easily. She asks questions about everything, and I have never been prouder of anything in my life than the fact that she has decided to keep asking. She also returned to her work with a different quality of focus, graphic design. She had always been gifted, but for years she had underplayed it in Harold's company, treating her income as secondary and her career as a pleasant supplement to his. Now she built her own client list. She raised her rates. She made decisions with the particular confidence of someone who has stopped waiting for permission. I watched her and thought, there she is. There is the woman she always was. As for me, there were things I carried from that year that I had not expected to carry. One was regret. Not the sharp, active kind, but the quiet kind that comes when you realize you saw something and chose not to push. I had noticed Harold diminishing Nora for years. I had filed it in a part of myself labeled not my place and told myself she was happy. She was adult, she would find her way. I had been afraid of overstepping, of being the difficult mother-in-law, of disrupting a life that looked, from the outside, like a good one. That caution cost her time. I sit with that honestly. What I have tried to do with that regret is make it useful. The autumn after Nora moved into her apartment, I began volunteering at a community legal clinic in Halifax. Nothing dramatic. I made tea. I managed paperwork. I helped people find the right forms. But I also talked to women. Mostly older women. Many of them in situations that had an uncomfortable familiarity. Marriages where the finances were handled entirely by someone else. Accounts they'd never been on. Documents they'd signed without reading. Situations that had seemed practical, and then, over time, become dangerous. I started a small group Wednesday evenings. 8 women the first week, 12 the second. We talked about basic things. How to find out what accounts exist in your name. How to access your own credit information. What it means to be named on a corporate document. What questions you are always allowed to ask. No judgment, no panic. Just information. One woman, 71 years old, a retired teacher from Dartmouth, told me she had not known the name of the bank holding her mortgage. She had been married for 43 years. I told her that was not unusual. I told her it was not her fault. And then I told her what she needed to know. She came back the following Wednesday with a notebook and a list of questions. That is, I think, how things change. Not in dramatic revelations. In one woman with a notebook and a list of questions. The letter from Harold arrived the following January. Handwritten, which surprised me. Addressed to Nora. She showed it to me because she wanted to, not because she needed my permission. It was not long. It did not make excuses, at least not elaborate ones. He wrote that he understood what he had done. He wrote that he had told himself, for years, that he was protecting her from complexity, from stress, from decisions she didn't want to make. He wrote that he could see now that had never been true. He had been protecting himself from the inconvenience of her knowing. He apologized. He asked for nothing. Nora read it twice, folded it carefully, and put it in a drawer. Do you want to respond? I asked. She thought about it. Maybe eventually. Not yet. That seemed right to me. Forgiveness is not something that arrives on a schedule. It comes when it comes, if it comes, and it belongs entirely to the person doing it. I did not write to Harold myself. I had nothing to say to him. What had happened between us was not personal. He had not diminished me. He had tried to diminish my daughter. And he had discovered, somewhat late, that this was something I was not prepared to allow. There are things I know now that I wish I had understood better. When Nora was young, when I was young, when the world still felt like a place where the right way to love someone was to smooth things over and keep the peace and trust that goodness would be enough. I know now that awareness is not the opposite of trust. You can love someone completely and still understand your own financial situation. You can be devoted and still know what your name is on. You can be a loyal partner and still ask questions. These things do not conflict. Anyone who tells you they do is protecting their own convenience, not your welfare. I know now that the most dangerous thing a woman can inherit is the belief that certain knowledge isn't for her. I know now that it is never too late to learn what you should have been taught at the beginning. At 63, at 71, at whatever age you are reading this, the information exists, the resources exist, the people exist who will sit with you and go through it without making you feel foolish. You are not too old. You are not too far in. You have not missed your chance. And I know this, above everything else. Your name is yours. It belongs to you alone. Whatever you sign, whatever documents bear it, whatever obligations it is attached to, that is your information to have. Anyone who keeps it from you is not managing things on your behalf. They are simply managing you. Nora is doing well. She told me last spring that she has started keeping her own financial records. Every account, every investment, every document in a folder she maintains herself. She laughed when she told me, a little embarrassed at how simple it turned out to be. Why did I think this was so complicated? She said. I looked at her. Because someone worked very hard to make sure you would. She nodded. She already knew that. I think she just needed to hear it said plainly. On Wednesday evenings, I still go to the clinic. The group has grown. Different women, different stories, the same recognizable shape beneath them. Last month, a woman in her late 60s came in. Elegant, precise. The kind of woman who has been composed her entire life. She sat in the back row and did not speak for most of the session. At the end, as everyone was gathering their coats, she approached me. I don't know if I belong here, she said. My situation is probably different. I poured her the last of the tea. Sit down, I said. Tell me. And she did. She always does. They all do, eventually. Because one of the truest things I have learned in 64 years is this. People do not need to be saved. They need to be listened to and informed and reminded that the knowledge they were told they didn't need is waiting for them whenever they're ready. It is always waiting.